Thanks a lot, Gary, and thanks for having me. Good afternoon. Hopefully everybody's enjoying the coolness for today. A lot better than it was the last 2 days. We're gonna we're gonna get into summer pruning, and there's only two times basically you want to do any pruning, and that's in the when the plants are dormant, and then summertime is the other time. And we're going to cover a lot of issues, but it's not that long of a topic. So we'll start. Why do you want to prune trees? And you want to improve the tree quality. You want to improve sunlight penetration. You want to increase air movement through the tree. And you want to increase the strength of the branches. So there's a bunch of other reasons to prune also. One is to prune to keep the tree in balance. And sometimes you'll see a lot of trees that'll get out of balance. One side will be heavier than the other side. They'll start leaning. So you want to try to maintain that balance for the tree. It's easier to access the fruit. And it reduces insects and disease damages. Improves the health of the tree. And the topics we're going to cover: just basic knowledge of pruning, when to prune, what to prune, what equipment to use, and then the objective and the different types of cuts. So the first thing you got to know is when you're looking at a tree or any kind of plant is you need to recognize the buds and the growth rings. So here's a picture that shows the different types. And you can see at the very end of the branch there, you have a terminal bud. Down below, you have leaf buds. And then below the leaf buds, you have a growth ring. And then below that growth ring, you have a fruiting spur. Limb angle regulates the growth. So if you cut a vertical position shoot, it's going to give you a strong vegetative growth, but not produce fewer fruit buds. So anything going vertical, if you take that out, you're going to get strength, but you're going to get less fruit. If you take a horizontal position shoot out, it's going to be weaker growth. However, you're going to get more fruit buds. So tree pruning. When do you want to prune it? When it's dormant, of course, is the best time to prune. In the summer. And then there's exceptions. So this picture I selected here, when it's dormant, the right side of the tree is the easiest way to see how to prune. In the summertime, unfortunately, you're going to have a full tree that's leafed out. So it's going to be harder to prune that tree. But a lot of people like to do the pruning in the summer also. And there are some exceptions, and we'll cover the exceptions of the rules. So tree pruning, dormant is the best time to prune. It's done during the dormant season. It tends to have an invigorating effect on tree growth. So that's why they choose the dormant season to prune trees the most. Summer pruning is done during the peak growth of the tree or the bush, and it tends to slow down the growth by removing leaves that manufacture nourishment. However, there's a problem with summer pruning. It can damage a tree if you do too much of it. And your general rule of thumb when you do any kind of pruning is you don't want to take off more than 30% of the tree. And I would recommend that, and that's during the whole year time that you do the pruning. So if you do a little bit of pruning in the dormant time, and then you do a little bit more pruning in the summertime, or vice versa, You just want to make sure you don't remove more than 30% of that tree. And then you have the post and the pre-dormant season. That's your summer or your spring and your fall. That's when you don't want to prune. That's the least desirable time to prune. And that usually causes the most damage to trees is when you prune during those time frames. Whenever you have a question, you want to go ahead and check the book, make sure it's a time to prune that tree, or check a fact sheet, but just make sure everything you check is always backed up. And the most type of trees that you prune are usually fruit trees. We're going to talk a little bit about the 4 seasons of pruning. Winter is considered January through March. And that's usually the dormant season where the leaves have fallen. And you can really get a good picture of the tree and see what it's going to look like after you take these, as you start taking the branches off. It gives you a vigorous growth in the spring. And certain trees are going to bleed, your maples, your walnuts, and your birches, but that's fine. They're going to drip out sap, but once the leaves start to emerge, that's going to stop. And this is where I got the information from. Spring is considered April to May, and pruning cuts will result in quick and often excessive regrowth. So that's where you have to be really careful and why you want to watch when you do pruning. If you start taking them off in that spring time frame, you're going to get an excessive growth on the tree. Now, if we're trying to prune bushes and shrubs and stuff like that, certain ones are going to be pruned right after they bloom, such as the lilac, the forsythia, the spirea. You want to avoid pruning shrubs in the late fall or late winter, which will result in a decreased bloom. And that's the ones that flower in the springtime. You want to watch and be careful when you prune. Pruning between the time when leaf buds start to swell and when leaves reach their mature size and color can disrupt the growth of the hormones, and that could cause harm to the tree. And it'll reduce, it'll give you more water sprouts. It'll give you a more vigorous regrowth. So you got to be really careful on those when you're pruning at this time frame. Summer and June, or summertime, June through August. So now's the time to be starting to do your summer pruning. And the reason you do the summer pruning is if you want to maintain a tree to keep it at a dwarf size, is when you want to do that, basically that top cut, that heading cut up on the top to keep that tree down in size, to keep it dwarf. Another reason to prune in the summer is the limbs that hang down too far when you're cutting the grass or to access the tree. You want to take those low-hanging branches off. And just be aware that late summer pruning may stimulate new tip growth that will not have time to harden off before cold winter weather hits. So that's another thing you have to watch out when you're pruning in the summertime. If you do it late summer, like in the August timeframe, you want to make sure you get it early enough that the tree has a time to heal. And fall time frame is September through December. Pruning cuts made this late may result in flush of vegetative growth. If we have a warming trend, you might get that vegetative growth during the winter, and the winter, they might not survive during the cold winters. You want to wait until the leaves have fallen if you want to start doing any pruning. That's usually when it's going into a dormant stage. For flowering trees that bloom in summer or fall on current year's growth, prune in the wintertime after the leaves have fallen. And you got to make sure you understand when the tree or the shrub is going to reproduce, or when it's going to get the new blossoms. We want to make sure you don't cut off the stuff that is going to blossom out for you next year. So make sure you understand the bushes you're doing and make sure you know what you're cutting. Okay, we mentioned there's exceptions to the rules. There are some exceptions. One of them is Asian pears. Another one is cherries. So the reason being is you want to make sure you prune these after. I always prune the Asian pears and cherries after you have gotten the fruit and taken the fruit off the tree. And the reason being is when you prune these in the wintertime, you open that tree up to diseases, and you most likely are going to get a disease inside the tree. So these are pruned during dry weather to prevent diseases from entering the cuts and spreading disease throughout the tree. So the biggest problem is the big question is, how do you see what to prune out while the tree is leafed out? So if you remember the picture at the beginning of the slideshow, it had half the tree was barren and the other half of the tree was completely leafed out. When that tree is barren, the Asian pears and the cherries, you want to take a look at that tree, and the easiest way to do it is to mark the branches with some sort of ribbon or tie a string around it, so you know which branches to take out during the summer. And make sure this stuff is visible, the ribbon or the string that you put on that tree, make sure it's visible that you can see, and just cut away when the fruit is taken. And that's the easiest way to mark your trees. And Asian pears and cherries are one of the hardest ones to do. They're the hardest ones to see what to take out. So it's easier to mark them when the leaves are gone and mark your branches. And then in the summertime, after the fruit has been taken, is when you want to take your cuts on those trees. And that way it gives them chances to heal up before the cold weather hits and the rainy season hits. But that's the biggest reason why you don't want to do Asian pears and cherries during the winter months with the rainy season. Okay, what kind of branches do you want to remove? And the easiest way I remember it is the 4 Ds of pruning. You want to take out anything that's damaged. So if you have a broken branch or a diseased branch, well, that's going to be one of the other ones here. A dead branch will be gone. You take a dead branch out. A diseased branch, and dysfunctional. So that covers the 4 Ds. So dysfunctional is considered a sucker, a water sprout, interfering branch, a crossing or vertical, upward or downward, double leader. And here's some pictures of those. So if you look for number 2 there, that is considered a broken branch. You want to remove that branch out of there. Your sucker is number 1 down at the bottom. You want to take that out. Number 3 is water sprout. Remove those. Interfering branch is number 4, something that crosses over or interferes with the light or the wind. You want to take that out. Upward or downward branches, remove those. And double leader is number 5, take those out. I can't stress enough about the type of equipment you want to use. Pruners, you want to make sure they're a bypass type pruner. Loppers, bypass also. And we'll get into those. You can use saws, chain bow saws, or pull saw.
Got it.
And then ladders. I recommend using an orchard ladder so you can get inside the tree and won't interfere with the branches as much. They're a lot easier to work. You're going to also need some form, if you're using any type of pruner, you want to make sure you can sharpen the pruner. So you need files, emery paper. And if you're using any kind of sharp objects, you want to make sure you have safety equipment, gloves, and safety glasses. If you're using a chainsaw, you want to make sure you have hearing protection. And then once you make your cuts, or before you make your cuts, you want to use disinfecting. You want to disinfect your equipment by using either a alcohol, and 70% or better is fine. You can use a Lysol or a Pine Sol spray. And if you use a 10% bleach solution, you have to be aware that it can be corrosive and you must lubricate after you use it. Lubricating, you can use a chainsaw bar oil for your chainsaws or lubricating oil for your pruners. Just a WD-40 is fine. And the type of pruners, which ones are better to use, anvil or bypass pruners? I would recommend staying away from the anvil pruners, and we're going to discuss why here in a little bit. But there's your WSU recommends to use the bypass pruners. And the reason being is when you use a bypass pruner, you're going to cut the branch by smashing it. So the bypass pruners, the blades bypass each other and it gives you a cleaner cut. If you use an anvil type pruner, it ends up smashing your branch and it ends up causing the branch not to seal properly. And you can also leave the branch open to disease. And we're going to get into a little bit more on this cut. So when you're using bypass, loppers or pruners, that's what these look like right here. And here's what an anvil type pruner looks like, and an anvil type lopper looks like. So if you look at this and you see the different types, you have a hook blade on the bypass pruner with a blade, and the anvil type has an anvil and a blade. So here's your bypass cut. As you're looking at the branch, the blades are bypassing each other. It's giving you a nice clean cut, as long as your blade is sharp, of course. So here's your anvil cut, and you can see that the branch is supported by that anvil, and the blade is pushing down against that anvil, and it ends up smashing your branch. And there's also, when you're cutting with your bypass pruners or loppers, there's a proper way to cut. You always want to keep the hook part of the bypass pruner away from the main trunk of the tree. And you want to keep the blade that is going to bypass the hook towards the inside part of the tree, or closer to the main trunk of the tree or bush. And that way it'll get you a cleaner with no stub. So there's a right way. You always want to make sure the hook is down and not up. And you always want to make sure the bypass blade is closest to the trunk. When we're talking about objectives, when you're doing trees, you either want a central leader, an open center, And here's shows of those two. You can go into espalier or palmettes, and you can get pretty creative with the tree. At the demo garden at the Collets, they started out with espalier, and it's really grown pretty. It's gone pretty crazy down there. So we're gonna have to really prune that down pretty good down at the demonstration garden. And here's your central leader. If you're doing this, the top one is correct way to do it. And this is why, as you go through the years, you're going to prune it out. And then this is the way each year the tree should start looking. And by the end, by the 6 to 8 years later, you should have a beautiful looking tree. If you cut it too close to the top, you can see what happens to the tree. It starts to get too full up top and too bushy. So you want to make sure you prune it right and keep your branches separated enough that you don't end up with a bush on top, and you get a lot more clearance and air circulation through that tree. So there's the correct way to do a central leader and the incorrect way to do it. If you're using a whip or get a whip at a store, you want to plant it. You want to keep the first, second, and third bud of the whip, and then you want to make a heading cut up at the very top. You want to basically top that whip, and you want to keep that top roughly about 30 to 32 inches above the ground, and then let it form. And you also, if you nick that third bud right where it's showing you where the nick underneath that bud, that'll weaken that bud and make number 2 and number 1 bud stronger. So that's how you maintain a whip and start the whip tree going. All right, now we're going to get into some of the cuts that we're going to be making. A thinning cut is the preferred cut, and it's cutting out a whole branch or shoot all the way back to its origin. What it does, it opens up light channels and air channels, increases fruit production, and here's a sample of your thinning cuts. You can see on this first picture up here to the left what the tree looked like, and then the branches they took off, they took them all the way back to the origin, and that opened it up for air movement and light channels. And that's what that tree looks like after it's pruned. Heading cuts, on the other hand, is you're cutting off part of the branch or shoot, and you're just going to basically head it, a portion of the way up the branch. And that's what you want to try to avoid unless necessary. And a heading cut tends to close off light channels, and we'll show you why here in a couple minutes. It decreases your fruit production also. So if you do heading cuts on each of these branches here, you can see what it's going to start doing. It's going to start bushing out at the tips everywhere you did those heading cuts. It's going to send shoots out. So you can see it's going to start making that tree more bushier, and that's what you want to avoid. And here's some results of thinning cuts versus heading cuts. Up top, it shows you how to do a proper thinning cut and what a heading cut looks like. So they just, at the left-hand side, the top, they've done the thinning cut, and they've taken the branch all the way back to its origin. And then on the left-hand side, that was, on the right-hand side is a heading cut, and they just took it off a partial part of that branch and just took it off. So if you go down to the lower pictures, if you do a thinning cut, it's going to force new shoots to come out of that branch, out of that trunk of that tree, and start forming more. But if you do heading cuts, it's going to result in a more bushier tree. So here's what a heading cut will do to that bush or tree when you do it. If you go around the perimeter, so a lot of people are pruning bushes, they usually just take like a hedge clipper, and they'll just go right around the perimeter of the tree or the outside perimeter of the bush. And then this was going to result in a bushier bush, of course. So you're going to get a lot more closure in that bush, and it's going to make it more full. So if you're doing a boxwood, that's fine. But you wouldn't want to do this to an apple tree or cherry tree or anything like that, because it's just going to create more problems for you. So here's what happens when you do heading cuts. It's going to stiffen or shorten a branch. It's going to increase branching. A lot of people do it to control height. If you're driving down the road, a lot of times you see these type of trees along the side of the road, usually around wires where people have power wires or telephone wires coming in, and they'll just take cuts. Or they want the branches away from the street so they don't fall in the street, and they'll just, the county or the city will do heading cuts all over the place just to protect the people and the streets. And after you do a heading cut, this is usually what it looks like after it's finished if you don't maintain it. So here's techniques when you're cutting. A flush cut, you want to make sure you leave the collar, but you don't want to have any stub. If you leave a stub, it's going to cause you to get a water sprout going up. You want to be careful not to cut the collar. So you just want to cut right next to that collar. And if you leave the collar, it'll form a nice scab over top of your cut. So just go slow, take your time, and look at it. Look at the branch when you're cutting it, and make sure you don't cut it too close or too far away from that collar. So you can see here where they did a close cut, and that's what you want to avoid. That's that inner cut right next to the trunk. Your target is to just leave that collar there and just cut right next to it. You want to angle your larger cuts. And another important rule is do not put a dressing on it. The tree will heal itself. Stay clear using dressings. It's not recommended. It used to be back in the olden days, but they changed their theory on it, and they just want the tree to heal. If you're taking down too big of a branch, and you have to be careful with that, you want to make basically a three cut, so the weight of the branch doesn't strip the bark away and open up a bigger cut on the tree. So what they recommend to do is cut on the lower end of the branch. You want to cut a notch out first, and then make your second cut on top of the branch, dropping that branch down, and that way you can come back to the lighter weight and then make your proper cut on the third cut right next to the collar. That way, when that heavy branch falls, it will not rip the bark away from the tree and damage the tree. So in summary, we covered basic knowledge, why you want to prune, the difference in vertical and horizontal shoots, when to prune, what the best seasons are to prune, the 4 Ds, damaged, dead, diseased, dysfunctional, the types of equipment to use, your objective, and that's the shape that it's desired, and then the cuts, the 2 different types are the thinning and the heading cuts. And this is where the references are that I used. And Gary also has a copy of all these references, and it's also on the PowerPoint if you get a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, but he has all that information. If you email him through this site here, you can get all that information back. He can get that information back to you.